Welcome to Great Minds with Lost&Found, the podcast that connects people and reimagines systems to improve mental health for youth and young adults. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen. Lost&Found is a comprehensive nonprofit organization that aims to do more to eliminate suicide for youth and young adults in the United States. Now that you know who we are and what we're all about, let's get to the show. Welcome back to Great Minds with Lost&Found. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen, and here with me today is Michelle Trent from the Compass Center. Michelle, if you would just start us off with a brief introduction of who you are, and we will jump into the conversation right after that.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Michelle Trent. I'm the executive director at the Compass Center. I've been with the Compass Center for almost 10 years. It seems like it's flown by. I have worked with victims of trauma my entire career, and that's really kind of where I am an expert in. I have a background in mental health therapy, and that's how I started in the field, and now I'm the director.
That's amazing. Well, thanks so much, first off, for the work that you do. Yeah. I mean, it is not for the faint of heart to be in mental health or to support victims and survivors of trauma. So just very grateful for the work that you do, because we can't do our work without people like you.
Yeah, thank you.
So let's start with the basics, Michelle. When we look at the current situation of mental health and of trauma in America, I want to know a little bit about what that looks like. So we're on the heels of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. You work in that space of providing support to survivors and victims of sexual assault, rape, sexual misviolence, human trafficking, child abuse, domestic violence, etc. You probably do more than that, but those are just the things that I know that you're working with. Mm-hmm. What is that like in terms of the work that you're doing and how it relates to mental health?
Yeah, gosh, there's such an intersection between trauma and mental health. And whether you're talking about the trauma that we work with or the trauma that other people work with, trauma is such an integral part of mental health. For us at the Compass Center and doing the work that we do, we see an increase almost every year, almost every day sometimes, in the amount of victims that we're seeing, the amount of victims that are in our state in general. Yeah. So South Dakota is number 3 in the nation for sexual assault per capita.
Wow.
So, there's a lot of victims in our community, and unfortunately, sexual violence, domestic violence, family violence is a really hard topic. And so we also know that there are victims that are not seeking services because they're afraid to talk about the things that are happening to them.
Absolutely.
And so that obviously contributes to some terrible mental health concerns, because then you have people that are suffering with extreme abuse and don't have any outlet for those pieces.
Can you talk a little bit further about, you just referenced that we're the 3rd in the country for per capita rates of sexual violence. Can you talk a little bit more about trends and statistics that are relative to the work that you're doing here in South Dakota?
Yeah, absolutely. So, South Dakota has wavered in the top 10 for sexual violence per capita since I've been at the Compass Center. We were number 2 for a while. Excuse me. We were number 2 for a while. Then we dropped to number 7. Now we're back up to number 3. And so we just kind of hover there in the top 10. And we see more and more sexual violence happening every day. And we see that it expanding. So with technology expanding and all of those kinds of things, we see things like sextortion, using child pornography is something that's huge. All of those kinds of things just keep evolving. And the ways that people perpetrate violence upon each other keep changing with the times. Domestic violence is the same, in the sense that it's ever increasing. If you look at the city of Sioux Falls specifically, if you look at numbers for domestic violence calls from the police department, those have gone up and up and up and up and up. The police are responding to thousands of calls per year of domestic violence. We also see that evolving, and the type of abuse that perpetrators use evolving with the use of technology and just with time. So, it's a constant. We feel like we're constantly catching up with technology of how abusers are using that to facilitate their abuse on others.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. Wow. Totally random question, but related to what you were just saying, with increases that we've seen here in Sioux Falls. The COVID pandemic, when we were locked down and families who maybe have family violence situations going on in their homes can't really escape or go anywhere. What was that like? Did you see increases during that time? Did you see a greater increase in your services going out because people just needed that space? Or talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, the pandemic was a really interesting thing, obviously, for everyone, and to see how it impacted our work was interesting. What we saw in domestic violence was that we didn't get a huge influx of new reports right away in the beginning. But what we saw was violence that may have already been occurring in that home increased. So the level of severity for victims, we were seeing victims with, weapons used against them or more significant injuries.
Yeah.
And that is really attributed to people were around each other all the time. And so there was more access for the perpetrator to inflict harm on victims. And so we saw a lot of those reports coming out as the world started opening up again.
Yeah.
We saw those folks coming in and explaining what happened to them. Then with sexual violence, we know that sexual violence was occurring, but we also know that people were not reporting. So the main route to reporting sexual violence typically is going to an emergency room. And what victims have told us is, I didn't want to go to the emergency room because I was scared to get COVID, and I didn't want to tax an already overwhelmed system.
Yeah.
So we saw on the news, nurses and doctors and people were just so overwhelmed and overtaxed with the amount of COVID patients. So we had victims saying, I didn't want to add to that. And so sexual assaults were happening, they just weren't being reported. And so people were trying to deal with the ramifications of that on their own without any support. So it was a really interesting thing. As we've come out of the pandemic, now our numbers just keep going up and up and up, and we hear these stories about what happened during the times of lockdown, and it's heartbreaking to hear those stories.
Absolutely. It's so heartbreaking. I hear these stories daily just like you do, and I'm sure I'm only getting snippets of it. So gosh, I simply can't imagine. Wow. So we are thinking about risks associated with sexual abuse, domestic violence, human trafficking, etc. As it relates to risk of suicide specifically. What's the correlation like? If you even can speak to that. I don't know if that's something that you would be able to or not.
Yeah,
but.
Absolutely. I certainly can't give you numbers, statistics, because I just don't remember them that way. But what I know anecdotally from the work that we do is people who have experienced trauma are likely to consider suicide at some point. So, if we take sexual violence, specifically like human trafficking or domestic violence, where a victim feels trapped and oftentimes are very trapped by their abusers, sometimes those victims will absolutely consider suicide and attempt suicide as their only route out. They look at it and go, I don't know what else to do. I've tried everything. I can't escape this. I don't want to be here anymore. And then we have, people that have left those environments and are kind of post-trauma, where they're maybe in a stable space now, but dealing with all of those pieces and dealing with the intimate part of sexual violence, family violence. It touches a person differently than other forms of violence. And so that own personal shame that comes with it is often very triggering for people to contemplate suicide. Then we also know that victims are likely to try to escape from the pain of their trauma, and so they may use substances, and we all know that also can equate to suicide attempts or tries when we're talking about adding substances into the mix. And so there's certainly a lot of risk factors for victims as they go forward.
Yeah. Wow. So when it comes to risk factors and, doing the work that we do in suicide prevention as an organization, we utilize the CDC's 7 strategies, for suicide prevention. First, I want to ask if you're familiar with them at all. And secondly, how that you are utilizing them. And I just made a couple of notes for you thinking like ways in which that I envision that you all are utilizing them. But let's start with, are you familiar?
Yes, I am familiar, with my work in mental health as a mental health professional. I'm certainly familiar. This is a topic that, is super important for mental health professionals to understand and be aware of, because so many of our clients are at risk for contemplating or attempting suicide. So I'm certainly aware of them. In our work, we try to do a lot of pieces. As I look at the list that you've created, the first one is creative protective environments. And our first value at the Compass Center is safety. And so really looking at what does safety mean, not just physical safety, but emotional safety. And so really focused on our goal is to help people move forward. And the first step in that is finding safety.
Yeah.
And so we assess every person that comes in our door for safety, whether that's physical safety, like, are you in a safe place? Is your home safe? Are there dangerous people? But then we also assess for suicide and risk factors that would go along with that for every person that calls in for our services, because we know that people are not likely to just come out and say, here's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
But the reality is that they're probably thinking about that. So every person that calls for support from the Compass Center receives those screenings to make sure that they're safe.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's, I think, a really important practice to make sure that we are meeting the needs of victims when they're not always able to verbally tell us those needs,
Well, and they probably aren't expecting you to ask those questions. And so they're like, wait,
Yeah.
oh, maybe I am experiencing ABC.
Yep, absolutely. And, we talk about the past 6 months, we talk about the past year. So it's not just, are you right now suicidal, but also have you, in the past year, have you experienced that? Because we also know that trauma tends to be triggered at various times.
Yep.
And we never know what brings up trauma sometimes. And so they may not be suicidal today, but something could happen tomorrow that would create those memories coming up and make that very challenging. Healthy connections, teaching, coping, and problem solving skills, those are, the foundation of what we're doing.
Yeah.
What we always say is healing comes out of connection. It doesn't come out of any fancy thing. It comes out of connection and healthy connection with other people.
That's amazing. I love that.
Yeah. And so we are trying to always facilitate how can you connect with another person in a healthy way. And so that can foster relationships, but that can also be a protective factor for suicide, but also is part of how to heal from trauma is connection. And same with coping and problem solving skills. A bulk of the work that we do when we think about trauma, the first probably half of the trauma counseling is focused on how do you cope? What are healthy coping skills that you can use when various things come up?
Definitely. Wow. I love that you're utilizing so many of these strategies and that it seems intentional. It seems very well structured, because there is that overlap between abuse and trauma and suicide, a risk of suicide. So I love that you're utilizing these. Moving forward a little bit, so Lost and Found, we serve youth and young adults primarily, but we also serve and support their support systems because obviously when young people are struggling with any sort of mental health challenges specifically related to suicide, we know that the parents, families, peers, teachers, clergymen, women, etc., are people that these young people are looking to for support and need to have these answers. So I'm curious about the specific trends among this group that you work with. And, how many people are you seeing that are between this age group of really 10 to 21, which is kind of the high rate of numbers that we're serving, and the population, the demographic group that, is very high risk of suicide. But also, as it relates to sexual violence and domestic violence, those ages are typically times that you're starting to see that stuff. So what are those trends? What are these patterns? What are the services that you're providing for people at that age group? I know that was a lot of questions all coming at once, but
great questions. Yeah. In the past, probably 5 to 10 years, our numbers of children that we're serving from as young as 3 all the way up through 18 and beyond have increased dramatically. So I just pulled numbers today as I was driving over. My office director pulled the numbers. So about 30% of our total victims that we see on a yearly basis are under the age of 18.
Wow.
Specific to the age range of 10 to 21, I had her pull those numbers this morning, and that's about 20% of the clientele that we serve on a yearly basis.
Dang,
so
that's high numbers.
Yeah, that's high numbers. And we also know, though, that that's just the tip of the iceberg for kids that are experiencing violence. And so we also know that the risk factor age, when you talk about highest risk factor for sexual violence is between the ages of 10 and 25. Yeah. So the two overlap, very specifically of this is when sexual violence is often happening the most, it's also when there's all this other stuff that's happening in the lives of young people.
Yeah.
And so it's a super stressful time. I think we don't always recognize as grown-ups the amount of stress that our children, our adolescents, our young adults are under. And when you really stop to look at that, man, there's a lot of stress for them, developmentally and socially, and all of those pieces that they don't know how to deal with and don't always have capacity to talk about. The Compass Center offers services to those kiddos. So we, starting at age 3, we're able to do play therapy. So ages 3 up to 12, we do play therapy. We also offer a program called parent-child interaction therapy. And so this would be for kids under the age of 12, parents that are struggling maybe with managing behaviors or those kinds of things. They can utilize that. We also are embarking on two new programs. The first is Little Navigators, which Lost and Found is helping us do data collection on. Little Navigators is our preschool program focusing on early prevention and intervention for preschoolers who are at risk of violence or have already been exposed to violence.
Wow.
And so we have mental health professionals in childcare settings that are providing services to the childcare setting and the childcare staff, as well as those children and families. And then our newest program, which we are just getting up and running, is called Youth VIP, Youth Voices in Prevention. And it will really target middle school and high schoolers and get them a part of how do we solve violence, because teens and young people don't look to adults for those solutions, right?
Nope.
They go to their peers.
Yeah.
And so we want them to be involved in the fight of saying, this is not okay, and here is how we prevent it. And so that will be a new program that we're debuting. We just got funding for it. So we're working out logistics of that, and that will be a new program that we're offering to support youth. It will train them to be advocates for sexual violence and domestic violence. And then it will also train them to be the presenters to their peers. So they will create the presentations and they will go out to their peers
That is so cool.
and educate them. Yeah. So we're very excited about that program and really looking forward to it.
Well, congrats on getting that up and running.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Obviously we serve youth and young adults. And so we have started implementing peer support programs as well, because the statistics show, the data shows that young people are not coming to us for support. They're going to their peers. And so it's really cool that we have peer programs like yours starting to come on board, because they're critical. They're so important, and we've seen them be effective.
Yeah. And we have seen some major things in area high schools and those kinds of things where there'll be a big situation that happens, and later you're going, okay, how did this happen? And you start to talk about it, and all of these students knew it was happening, right? And they just didn't know what to do. We haven't equipped them with what do I do when I find out that this thing is happening? And so they kept it because they didn't know what else to do. And so that's really an area where us as a community, we have to step up and give them the tools of, when this is happening, what do you do?
Yeah.
Because teens are expressing to us, I knew that it wasn't okay. I knew that it was unsafe, but I didn't know what to do. And so I didn't do anything. Yeah. And so that's really, I think, a failure of us as the grownups of, if you don't know what to do, that's because we haven't given you the tools of what to do.
Absolutely. 100% agree. Oh, that's so cool. I love that. I can't wait to see more about that program.
Yeah,
wow.
We're really excited about it. It's a federal grant, so of course, there's federal stuff that you got to jump through, but hoping to get it up and running this fall.
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah.
Since we work directly with this population and we want to ensure the best care for them, what are some warning signs of abuse that we can be looking for, that peers can be looking for? And maybe this is stuff that you're teaching in this new program, but I'm curious, as we Lost and Found and we, a community, are supporting our young people and building them up for the future generation, what do we need to be looking for?
Yeah, I think the first thing is looking for, do your teens understand what healthy relationships are? I see so often with teens this kind of all or nothing, where it's like, once I get into a relationship and I'm dating, like, that's the only person I can talk to. That's the only person I can speak to. And I am completely all in with that person. That's a warning sign for unhealthy behavior, but also is a huge red flag for abuse, right? Because if one person can control the other person and they're only with that person, then who do you go to when something bad is happening? So if you're seeing teens that are in relationships where it's like, I'm not talking to anyone else, the only person I'm ever talking to is this other person, that's a warning sign. And that's a dialogue about what does a relationship look like. I think anytime you have a teen that is talking about things like my significant other threatened suicide if I broke up with them, or threatened, to do something drastic, that's a huge warning sign that something is going on. And then those subtler signs are change in behavior. It's funny when we talk about warning signs, they all intersect so much. So when we're talking about what are warning signs for kids that are contemplating suicide, they're often the same, right? Changes in behavior, changes in their lifestyle, things that they used to love doing that they no longer do, or someone, maybe it's, I used to go to the gym and now my boyfriend says I can't go to the gym any longer. Well, that's a warning sign that there's some control factors in there. I think anytime, when we're talking about sexual violence, anytime there's a drastic change in appearance or in hygiene, that's often something that is a red flag for violence happening. Anytime there's something where it's like something happened, but we don't want to talk about it, I would be concerned about sexual violence.
Yeah.
But I think the first thing to really do and equip our teens with and our families with is what does actually a healthy relationship look like? And how do you spot the red flags for, gosh, that's maybe concerning? And how do I, as a parent, intervene when not only my child might be the victim, but I also may have a child that is the perpetrator and is not understanding that that is not healthy.
Correct. Yeah. Wow. I love that. Moving forward a little bit, I want to talk about considering solutions. So we've heard a little bit about the current trends, the statistics, the overall kind of ecosystem, your work. Now I want to move forward to solutions and how we can maybe increase and improve the support structures that we have here in South Dakota. To my knowledge, there's not a lot of organizations that are doing the work that you all are doing with the Compass Center. Is that true?
There are really fantastic organizations across the state. So there's about 75 victim service providers across the state that are providing really great services. The Compass Center is the only organization that meets the definition for a rape crisis center. And so we are the only organization in South Dakota that meets that definition.
Yeah.
And so we work specifically with sexual violence. We also work with domestic violence and those kinds of pieces, but we have a sexual violence response team and all sorts of pieces related specifically to sexual violence. But that being said, there's never enough services to go around. We unfortunately have a waiting list for our counseling services, which is always a really hard decision for us. But, there's just a lot of people that need support in our community.
Yeah. Do you think that the need for services for victims and survivors of this kind of abuse and behavior is being met in South Dakota with 75 great providers, but also only one that's technically, by definition, a rape crisis center?
Yeah. I would say that I can collectively speak for the whole of 75 providers that there's not enough resources to go around. One of the issues that we have in our state is that we don't receive any state funding for the work that we do. With the exception of the last couple of years, the legislature has appropriated dollars to us, which has been phenomenal and has really transformed our ability to do our work. But that ongoing funding that's coming from the state is such a huge capacity. And what we know is that when we don't fund these services, this impacts workforce, it impacts child labor, all of those kinds of things. It impacts society if we don't have services for victims. So collectively, I think we can say, no, there's not enough resources, and we could always use more resources to meet the need.
Definitely. Thank you for that honesty.
Yeah.
From your experience and perspective, what do we need to do to make sure that people in these situations are getting the help that they need? And, you have already talked about people not wanting to, tax an overworked and overwhelmed system. You've talked about, people not wanting to get help because they're a perpetrator is, threatening acts of suicide or acts of violence, or, maybe it's something totally different, but those are just two examples that you've already given. What else do we need to be doing to get these victims, these survivors, the help that they need?
Yeah, well, I think it starts young, where we start talking about what healthy relationships look like. I think we also have to, as a community, bring this out of the darkness. I think,
Yes.
so often domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking exists in the shadows of society. And as long as something can exist in the shadows, it can't ever be solved because nobody's paying attention to it. And so I think this is really about, what does the community say about this is not acceptable in our community, and how are we taking a stand as a community to say no? So that starts with education about what are these problems? How can we as businesses, church groups, community groups get education and develop policies and procedures that say, not only is this not acceptable, but here is what we're going to do when we find out that something like this is happening. Because we often talk about victims, but what we like to shine the light on is perpetrators are being employed someplace, right? They are employed someplace. Somebody is seeing this behavior outside of their home.
Yeah.
Because you can't hide it. And so if employers, if our community steps up and says, this is not okay, and when you do these things, it's going to have real consequences on your life, that will start to transform the way that victims are perceived, the way that perpetrators are perceived.
I like that, spinning the narrative and making sure that we're focused on both parties is so important. So I used to work as a sexual assault investigator. I was in education prior to working in the nonprofit space.
Sure.
And that was something that we always talked about, was like making sure that we are remaining unbiased when working with both the perpetrator and the victim, but also making sure that we are not perpetuating the behavior of the perpetrator.
Absolutely.
And supporting the behavior and the healing and support of the victim, while also, playing both sides. We have to be unbiased, we have to help both of these people, because ultimately both of them need help in some capacity. And so I love that you just referenced both sides of that.
Yeah, and I think, as we start to transform as a community and start to say, this is not acceptable in our state, when we really take up that mantle and start that argument, what we see then is tougher laws related to victimization, more treatment programs for perpetrators. That's a huge need in our communities, that there are a few really fantastic programs, but there's not enough in our state to really treat offending behavior and catch offending behavior long before it ever turns into offending behavior in our children.
Definitely. Another solution that I often think about is through collaboration from different agencies, different entities. We talked about earlier the overlap of warning signs, whether it's suicide, whether it's sexual abuse, whether it's child abuse, whether it's whatever. A lot of the warning signs are the same. And so therefore, a lot of us can work together. So how are ways that we can collaborate, both the Compass Center and Lost and Found, outside of our work already together with the Little Navigators program, but also as a community in terms of healthcare systems? How can we all work together to do this better?
Yeah, man, I love this conversation, because there's so many organizations that are doing tremendous work. And we all know in the nonprofit world, there's never enough funds to go around, right? Every organization never has enough money to do all of the things. And that's where I think collaboration is such an important piece, because if I don't have the funding, but you have a different revenue stream, we can come together and build a program that meets all of these needs. And sometimes, unfortunately, what we find is that there's organizations that are doing the same thing and they don't even know those things.
Yeah.
And so really working on collaboration means communicating, being open and honest and transparent about what it is that we as organizations are doing and where we need additional support. So I love partnerships with, Lost and Found and with other organizations that are outside on the peripheral of the work that we do, but you're not really on the periphery. So many of our victims have contemplated suicide or attempted suicide. And so the work is really adjacent to one another, but so integral to working together. You know, we partner with Children's Inn, we partner with Call to Freedom, we partner with the Boys and Girls Club and MB and all of these organizations because that's where victims are. And the other thing that is hugely important to us as an organization is removing barriers.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of barriers that get in the way of people being able to access services. And so by partnering, we remove those barriers. If we're already in the child care center, they don't have to drive anywhere. They can receive our services without ever having to go anywhere. So collaboration is a big piece of the work that we do.
Yeah. I fully believe that collaboration is the difference maker when it comes to nonprofit work. So
Agreed.
I think that the removing barriers piece is honestly the biggest, and that is why collaboration is so important.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it's, especially in Sioux Falls, when we have one of the largest networks of nonprofits in the nation, there's so much that we can be doing. And this community loves it. I mean, we rally behind support and we rally around each other. So let's do it. Yeah. Moving forward here, I'm like, where are we at? What are some challenges specifically related to the mental health of those that you serve? Is there any like major common things that you're noticing?
Yeah, there's a couple that spring to mind. The first being that people that have mental health diagnoses are more at risk of sexual violence, domestic violence because of that mental health diagnoses. So when there is that diagnosis, it already puts them in a category of risk because perpetrators look for vulnerabilities and they look to take advantage of that. So that's one area that we see often where people are they had existing mental health concerns. Then you put a victimization on top of that. And then that mental health concern is exacerbated by trauma. The second piece that we really struggle with, I think organizationally, but also system-wide, is individuals who are using substances who are victims, because there's two folds of this of when you are at risk of victimization or being victimized, you're more likely to turn to substances to escape that. And we also know that perpetrators use substances as a way to abuse people. So forcing people to take drugs or alcohol or whatnot. And then we also know that after victimization, victims often turn to substances to numb the pain because of their experiences. And so how do we help victims who are using substances? Because, you know, sometimes it's like the chicken or the egg argument, right? You know, the trauma is creating those pieces, but they can't start working on the trauma until they have healthy coping skills. Because if we start working on the trauma, then that is going to send them down a path where they're using more substances. And so it's this balance of how do you work within that system with the chemical dependency system and trauma, because it's so intertwined. And so those are our two kind of biggest struggle areas of, you know, they cross so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never thought about it in that way, but I guess now that I'm like reflecting back on my time in this work, I see that absolutely 100%. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting how as you get older and you move out of positions, the things that you suddenly see. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to talk about being trauma informed. I think that's something that we would be remiss if we didn't talk about today in this conversation. How do you train your staff to be trauma informed? What does trauma informed practices in this work of, you know, victim advocacy and support? What does that look like? I could ask a million questions about being trauma informed, but from your perspective, what does that look like?
Yeah, you know, I think trauma informed care is such a pivotal part of the work that we do, of really understanding what has happened to somebody rather than assuming something about their character. And so we are always looking at how do we train our staff? How are we constantly putting that in front of them? Because trauma makes you do weird things.
Absolutely, it does.
A traumatized person may interact in maybe inappropriate ways or in ways that are aggressive to get their needs met, but that's not because they are an aggressive person. It's because of their trauma. And so getting everyone in our organization to understand when a person comes in yelling, the first thing is to say, what happened to this person, rather than to focus on that other stuff. So, you know, it's a constant work. It's constantly educating, it's constantly talking about it. But then it's also about, I like to tell my staff, it's not just about trauma-informed care, it's about trauma responsiveness. So it's not enough to know that trauma is causing that. It's about what are you doing as an organization to change policy, procedure, sometimes even things like what does the waiting room look like in your organization, and how does that help or hinder a person who has experienced trauma? And sometimes we can't change those things, but part of it is being aware, and not just being aware, but changing practice based upon this would not be helpful for a person who has experienced trauma. And so I think what I always encourage organizations is you got to take the next step, that if you're not willing to be trauma responsive, it's kind of doesn't even make sense for you to get educated on trauma, because if you're not going to do anything with it and just say, oh, well, we know about trauma, but we don't do anything.
Why?
Why are you doing that? Yeah. So it's about trauma responsiveness, I think, and being willing to listen to victims. We can't possibly set up environments for every person who has been traumatized, but allowing their victimization to hold truth. And when they say things like, I can't be in that waiting room because of X, Y, or Z, not saying, well, sorry, that's the only option, but saying, gosh, thank you for telling me that. I wouldn't have thought of that. Let's figure out an alternative for you, because we don't want you to be traumatized when you walk in our waiting room. So it's not necessarily always about how do we change, but how do we embrace that, yes, thank you for communicating this, and thank you for telling us, and we will work with you to find something that works for you, rather than saying, nope, this is the way that it is.
Yeah. Wow. I love the word trauma responsiveness, and the fact that you are being so intentional about not only being informed, but being responsive. That I think is so important. I think back to, again, my days working in education and, working in sexual assault advocacy. And it was when the Title IX laws were changing. And so I was meeting with our attorney pretty regularly, trying to figure out how are we going to handle this and respond to things appropriately, while also meeting the new guidelines that, obviously don't match my alignment or the university alignment or, whatever. Maybe it does, but where do we have to go from here, and how do we implement that and be responsive to this? And, some of these mediations that they now allow through the new guidance, where it's they're bringing perpetrator and victim together or together virtually. I'm like, that is so harmful. That's so triggering. That's so traumatic. And I can't imagine. So the fact that you're talking about not only being informed, but then actually responding to that, I think that's so important, because you don't see that in every organization.
Yeah. And I think in that, it's such an important piece that we put victims in the driver's seat of what is best for them instead of assuming. And so when we allow them to be in control, we give them a piece of healing back.
Yeah.
Because their victim or their perpetrator took away their control.
Yep.
And so trauma responsiveness is about accepting that what you say about what you need is acceptable.
Yeah.
And I'm going to value that.
Absolutely. So rounding us out here, we've only got time for probably a couple more questions. So I want to ask the big one, and that is, what can we as a community do to reduce the stigma associated with sex-based and family-based violence?
I think the first thing is talk about it. When we don't talk about it, then it feels like a secret. So if the community as a whole talks about it, if the community says, hey, I am going to get education about this. I'm going to go out and educate myself about it. I'm going to talk about it with my social circles. I'm going to ask my boss, what are we doing to prevent sexual violence? What are we doing to prevent family violence? What are we doing to respond to victims? When we start having these conversations, it pulls it out of the shadows. And so the community can step up by saying, I'm not going to keep it a secret. I'm going to say the word sexual violence. I'm going to say the word rape, because we so often go, ooh, I don't want to say those
dirty
words.
Word. It's
exactly.
Scary. Yeah.
But when we do that, we put shame on it.
Yep.
We put shame on it for everyone around us who's watching us, and they go, oh, well, she's uncomfortable with that word, and so I'm not going to say that word anymore. Or my boss doesn't like it when I bring up sexual harassment, and so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. So the more we can get comfortable having those conversations, the more we do to take it out of the shadows and reduce stigma.
That's huge. Yeah, I think that's just beyond so important to just vocalize and normalize the conversation. I mean, we do it in suicide all the time.
Yep.
I actually left my last position because I was told that I couldn't talk about a
Oh,
suicide that occurred. I was there when it occurred.
sure.
You know, I was offering support in first aid and first response, and the student took their life. And I was told by senior administrators that I could not talk about the experience and that I couldn't say that it was a suicide. And I left my position because I said, if you're if you're stigmatizing this and shaming this act, we're not honoring this student. We are not honoring the students that are going to come along that have similar lived experiences. You're not honoring me as a staff member.
Yep.
And I'm not okay with that.
Yep,
Like, you are
absolutely.
perpetuating this behavior. You are being complicit in this.
Absolutely.
And so I left my last position because I was like, we have to be normalizing this because that's how we reduce the stigma. So I'm so glad that you just talked about that.
Yeah, I love it.
I wanted to chat a little bit about the Me Too movement. We don't have to get into that a ton just because of time, but since that really came out on social media, and there is a voice for this work now and for people to share their stories, and we're seeing it all the time online and in our communities, how has that helped or hindered the work that you do?
I think it's been both sides. It has helped in the sense of it takes it out of the shadows, right? Because we know that people don't talk about it, but the reality is, a victim of sexual
Yes,
violence.
absolutely.
You absolutely do. And if you say that you don't, it's because you're the barrier to people being able to talk to you about it. So if you're sitting listening to this or sitting in the community and you go, gosh, I don't know any victims of sexual violence, the reality is you're probably the problem because they don't feel safe enough to tell you. And so it brought it out of the shadows and made it so that people can talk about it. I think on the flip side, you have the naysayers of the world that say, oh, now we've gone too far, and now, the people can just cry rape or whatever and assume that those are false allegations because they weren't disclosed in the beginning. And so while it's kind of good and bad that that's coming out, right? It's bad that people still believe that, but it's good that we understand that people don't understand trauma, right? They go, well, how come you didn't say something right away? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons if you understand trauma. And so understanding trauma is the first step to go like, oh yeah, it makes sense why a person would not come forward and disclose that they were being raped. That makes complete sense. It is absolutely within the realm of normal to not speak a word about being raped as a child or in a job or whatever the case might be. And so people not understanding trauma pollute the conversation where they say, well, gosh, that must be a lie because it's 10 years later and they haven't told anyone else.
I mean, not to bring politics into this, but I mean, the recent verdict for former President Donald Trump and, E. Jean Carroll, that. There's tons of conversations about that happening right now.
And man, I work in sexual violence prevention, and I don't know that I would disclose if something happened to me today. I would not report it. And there's a lot of reasons for that because I watch what happens to victims, and man, your life gets ripped apart, and that's not fun. And so when people say, they were a coward for not speaking up or something, it's actually the opposite.
Right.
It takes tremendous strength to be able to say something about it. And it takes tremendous strength to be able to not say something about it. Both sides are equally strong, and it's about what's
100%.
best for that person.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I'm loving this conversation right now. Okay, so final thoughts here. If you could remove all resources, all barriers, thinking about resources that are available, things that are possible in the future, money is not a question. You have a magic wand in your hand and you can wave right now and change the ecosystem of care for victims. What are you doing?
I think we're starting young. We're starting with support to families, to support to families with babies. It's not too much to say that, especially when we're talking about child abuse or those kinds of things, our society is moved away from connection. And so the more we move away from connection, the more problems we come into because connection is what helps us fuel healthy community. And so creating connection for families, creating connection for individuals, creating connection that is healthy. So talking about what healthy relationships look like, talking about consent, talking about that from a super young age, right? We can talk about consent. It has nothing to do with sex, but it has all about it is okay for me to dictate what happens to my body. So if I don't want to hug you, I don't have to hug you. And being able to have those open conversations, I think more education to families, to kids in that younger space is where we really prevent violence. And so that's what I would do with all of the money in the world.
I love that. Oh, thank you. Lastly, what do you believe would make the biggest impact in this work in our community, specifically here in Sioux Falls?
The biggest impact in Sioux Falls, education about trauma. I think that's such a huge piece of people not understanding what trauma actually looks like and the things that a traumatized person does. I think that would go a long way.
Cool. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and sharing your experiences in this tough work that you do. I want you to take just a moment here to share where people can find the Compass Center, your resources, your team, all of that jazz.
Yeah. So you can reach us calling 605-339-0116. You can go to the Compass Center. thecompasscenter.org is our website. You can also call 211 and ask to speak with the on-call advocate. You can also, if you're with law enforcement or at the hospital and you'd like to have an advocate come work with you, you can simply ask the hospital or law enforcement to get in touch with us, and they will get in touch with us and we'll send an advocate out. So calling us is the best way to reach us. We respond on the website as well and on Facebook, and reach out in some way, whatever way feels the most comfortable.
Amazing. Great. Well, thanks so much. As we wrap up, I always like to end with just a couple of fun questions. So what is one thing in your life that you've learned that you want everyone to know? It can be about your work or just in general.
Yeah. I have learned that people are really complex and there's always something going on beneath the surface. And so kindness and non-judgment go a long way, that you will always get better results when you assume that that person is not being just a horrible person, but that there's something else going on underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Michelle, for being here. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your partnership, the work that you do, the wisdom that you have imparted upon me and our listeners, and can't wait to connect again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Of course. All right, listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it. If you are someone that you know is struggling in any regard with mental health or with sexual and family violence, you can reach out to us at Lost and Found or to Michelle and her team at the Compass Center. All of that information will be left in the show notes at the bottom of the episode. And until next time, stay well. Thanks so much for listening. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review Great Minds wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information about Lost and Found, go to resilienttoday.org. That's ResilientToday.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Resilient Today. Until next time, do more and stay well.